The title of my article is Emotional Response of Neonatal Intensive Care Nurses to Neonatal Death. The purpose of this research was to, one, identify the emotional response of these nurses working on the unit, as well as their emotions to neonatal death. Some major things that were defined in this article were the back and forth emotions, the good versus the bad, the dilemmas and the empathy felt by these nurses, happiness they felt when the infant was thriving and being able to go home with their parents, versus the sadness that was felt when an infant died or was born with an abnormality. The professional satisfaction they received from being able to care for these infants and watching them grow and be able to go home, to the exhaustion, not only physically but mentally, when an infant was withdrawing from drugs or was born with a defect and they couldn't do anything about it. The responsibility they felt for these infants and the guilt they felt if they tried to revive an infant and weren't able to, or if they cared for an infant for so long and they didn't make it. They felt part of that guilt in thinking if everything they did was everything they could have done. The despair that they felt in those types of situations. Experiencing loss. It was described by many of the nurses as an unforgettable first loss, where they report remembering the first loss they ever experienced with an infant. Sadness they felt speaking about it years later. The difficulty they experienced in giving hurtful news, and the difficulties in dealing with some parents who couldn't accept their infant if they had an abnormality, and the shame they felt for that. The attachment they felt to these infants when having to care for them for a long period of time, also leading to burnout with long hours they've spent and the exhaustion they felt afterwards after dealing with so many losses. This research was important to conduct to allow for difficult discussion on real issues, in hopes to find ways to support other nurses in these situations, or newly licensed nurses who are interested in working on these units. This was a descriptive qualitative study where 7 nurses were interviewed, with 5 to 18 years experience, and the interviews conducted were 15 and a half minutes on average. The interviews were done by voice recordings, and researchers gathered the information, categorized, and themes were created. and then organized, and the findings were interpreted. The interview guide was used, and the findings were being a neonatal nurse, experiencing dilemmas and empathy, also experiencing neonatal loss. And the conclusions were nurses' emotions were positive. However, infants relapsing and neonatal death negatively affected these emotions. The biggest important points of this research were to describe in depth these emotions and stories the nurses had, to inform future nurses. However, there was no suggestions made regarding coping mechanisms these nurses used, or resources they utilized. They didn't point out who they reached out to or what they did to help them, which ultimately would lead to burnout and the nurses finding other units to work at or to stop working the bedside altogether.